Good afternoon and good morning from GMF. I'm Ian Lesser from GMF here in Brussels, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this discussion here today on debating US-Turkey security cooperation in light of many changes in the world and many difficulties of which we're aware. For those familiar with GMF and for those who are maybe learning about us for the first time, our mission is very simple, which is to strengthen transatlantic cooperation. And in that context, we've long had a strong interest in relations with Turkey in a transatlantic context. These relations have always been critically important, but they've always been very difficult to manage. And I'm sure we'll talk about many aspects of that here today. We have a wonderful new report which we're going to launch, and I'll let our moderator introduce our participants to you in a moment. But just to say, it's a very interesting study for a number of reasons. It treats the practical issues at stake, and they're very difficult ones, but it also talks a great deal about issues of trust and perception and the role of public opinion in the relationship between Turkey and the United States. And you'll hear a lot more about that. And I would say, actually, as someone who participated in the Delphi portion of this methodology, there is a kind of hidden benefit to this, which maybe is not so obvious, which is a hidden product, which is that it got a lot of very interesting people thinking anew about the relationship and hopefully in creative ways. So you'll hear lots more about that. Let me just, before I pass the floor to my colleague, Ceylan Canbilek in Ankara, I wanted to just say a word of thanks, actually several very important words of thanks. First to TOBB University for their collaboration in this project, to the US Embassy in Ankara for supporting it, to the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs for reflecting on some of our findings with us, giving us their feedback, and of course for all the Delphi study participants. Thank you so much for being part of this work. So with that, I look forward to our conversation, which will involve a number of my dear colleagues, but also a longtime collaborator of ours at TOBB University. But let me turn this over to Ceylan to moderate our conversation. Again, thanks to all of you for joining. Ceylan, over to you.
Thank you, Ian. Hello, everyone. A warm welcome from Ankara. I'm Ceylan Canbilek. I'm a senior program officer in the German Marshall Fund's Ankara office, and I will be moderating today's discussion. And Ian just provided a brief introduction to the project, and also our panelists today, Özgür Ünlühisarcıklı, Ankara office of the German Marshall Fund, and Şaban Kardaş, professor of international relations and political science at the TOBB Economics and Technology University, and GMF senior fellow Jonathan Katz will be elaborating further on the project, but not only limited to the report, but also on the overall status of the US-Turkey engagement. So I will not get into the details. Just as a staff member of the Ankara office, I also owe our own thanks to our sponsor, to the US Embassy in Ankara, and also to our project partner, TOBB Economics and Technology University. And I also have some brief housekeeping announcements to make. As you are most probably familiar with the Zoom webinars by now, only the speakers have access to their cameras and microphones. So if you want to ask any question or make any comments, please use the Q&A function, and the chat function will be disabled and raise hand is not encouraged. So we are looking forward to your comments and questions through the Q&A function. And while directing your questions, please make sure to whom your question is addressed to. And also we will make sure that all the questions within the time limit, all the questions or comments are addressed to after Özgür's, Şaban's, and Jonathan's input. And this discussion will be on the record. Without further ado, Özgür, I leave the floor to you. Please unmute yourself, and you can turn on your camera as well.
Thank you very much, Ceylan. Welcome, everyone. I know that I'm standing between the report you're looking forward to hearing about and you, so I will really keep my remarks very short, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the background of the report. Our point of departure was the observation that the US-Turkey relationship is in a perpetual crisis mode, and lately it has become very difficult to manage the crises under the existing framework, which we think was long obsolete. So we wanted to come up with a new framework for governing the relationship, which would make it easier to manage the relationship. In the beginning, of course, when we thought of this project, it was the pre-COVID world. So we were supposed to have a fancy international workshop in Istanbul and then a big public event in Ankara. But of course, life had other plans for us. And with the outbreak of the COVID pandemic, we had to revise our plans. So what we did was, first, as Ian mentioned, we conducted a Delphi study on the relationship. And let me also thank all of the participants who spent considerable time, actually, for the success of the Delphi study. Then we organized a virtual workshop with the participants of the Delphi study. In parallel to these, we developed a Twitter barometer which measured and actually which continues to measure in a sustainable way the emotional dimension of the public opinion or the elite opinion on the relationship. Let me tell you that, of course, we use the output of the Twitter barometer as input for the report, but this will actually be a sustainable tool and will keep evolving in the following months and years, and we will be able to monitor the emotional dimension of the elite opinion on the relationship in the future as well. Then we came up with the report that Şaban is going to present to you in a couple of minutes. So this report will be finalized after we receive feedback from you, from this group, which is actually very large, and then update the report, and then it will be published shortly. So let me not stand between you and the report any longer without any overdue to Şaban.
Thank you, Özgür. I just want to chime in just before leaving the floor to Şaban. I want to congratulate him because Şaban has been recently promoted to the rank of professor. So let me take this opportunity to congratulate you, Şaban. Kudos, and the floor is yours. Please unmute yourself and turn on your camera.
You need to turn on my camera because the
let me
message
try.
says the host has disabled my camera.
Just a second. We will fix it. You can
okay.
continue.
Yes, I guess I am back. Like America is back. I also need to, before I start, add another round of thanks to Professor Emre Erdoğan, who was assisting us with the Delphi study. Özgür, maybe it would be nice to thank Emre as well. As Özgür mentioned, we have drafted a report. It is co-authored by myself and Özgür, but he put me on the tight spot of presenting. But later, after the presentation, during the discussion session, Özgür will be back again to help me respond to the questions. We hope that the reactions from the audience will also feed into the final version of the report. We hope to receive comments, feedback. This is, in that sense, an evolving project. Some of the ideas which we put forward in the report, we have been circulating these ideas in the last few years at various occasions when we used to get together physically. I mean, during our exchanges, the need to address the issue of the strategic framework in the bilateral relationship has been there. The debate was evolving, but now that also there is a new administration in office and also a new search for finding a new framework for the relationship, the report became more and more timely, and we hope that with the input from the audience, the final report will make a good contribution. Ceylan, can I share the PowerPoint presentation to make it easier? We prepared a PowerPoint presentation to highlight some of the main points from the report, especially when it comes to the issues.
Yes,
It will
go
be
ahead,
helpful.
Şaban. You can just share it through your share screen.
Thank you.
Okay.
So the aim of our report is to suggest the elements of a new strategic framework to help manage Turkey-US strategic engagement. So in that sense, the emphasis on the elements is important because we do not claim to lay out a complete model that can be just taken from the report and applied. But we thought that it might be useful to put forward some ideas, some suggestions that can feed into the process between the two countries, Turkey and the United States, as they work to redesign their relationship. We hope that eventually the report could be helpful in terms of addressing some of the mutual suspicions, which I will mention in a second. Also, another major problem in the relationship, which is the institutional ownership problem. We hope that, again, the recommendations that will be put forward can address the issue of the deficit of trust as well as lack of institutional ownership in the relationship. And also we see a need to rethink how to introduce some confidence building measures into the relationship, as well as a mechanism to manage crisis. Because when we look at the Turkey-US relationship in the last few years, unfortunately, it has been characterized with constant and instant crisis time and again. And the relationship in most of the case, most of the time, has been in a crisis management mode. So very briefly, because most of you are familiar with those problems in the bilateral agenda, we see that the relationship, the crisis mode is driven by some underlying problems. So in most issues, when we talk about specific crisis, be it related to Syria, be it ISMED, be it S-400 crisis, the specific crises are the symptoms. They are reflecting some of the underlying problems that has become part of the structural nature of the two countries' relationship, and that are breeding the strategic divergence. So in the report, we refer to 4 specific problems that are at the very core of the current tense relationship, crisis-ridden relationship between the two countries. The first one is what we call the lack of a valid strategic framework, and as a matter of fact, this is the main focus of the report. This is what we will be trying to propose today in this report, and to the extent that the report can help address this lack of strategic framework, it can also help address the other 3 problems which are there. The report is also pointing out ways to address the other questions. So what we mean by it, we will see it later. The second core problem is the issue of distrust, which is fed by mutual suspicions. And as a matter of fact, all these suspicions that are driving the Turkey-US relationship are mostly known to most of us, but from the Turkish point of view, there are perceptions about the US intentions in regards to Turkey's neighborhood, also in regards to Turkey itself. And most of these perceptions are unfortunately negative. But on the US side, there are also some other perceptions. Each side has its own perceptions. And as a matter of fact, eventually these mutual perceptions fed mutual suspicions, which eventually undermined the trust. So there is the deficit of trust as we identify in the report. And from the Turkish point of view, the most important problem to name is, of course, the US engagement and support to the PKK terror organizations affiliates in Syria. Also the overall US positioning in some phases of the Syrian crisis. This remains #1 source of suspicion And the other issue is about the FETÖ terror group and the US non-compliance with the Turkish demands vis-a-vis FETÖ, but in that respect also the overall issue of the perceived US interference in the Turkish domestic affairs. This is also feeding another round of suspicions on the Turkish side. Also, the third important area of suspicion from a Turkish point of view is the reliability and credibility of the US as a security provider, which is eroding, but especially the use of language of sanctions in recent years, which has become part of a kind of coercive diplomacy vis-a-vis each other between the two sides. This is also, I think, leading to a big source of tensions on the Turkish side based on our study. And especially the US is considered to some extent as an hostile power, threatening Turkey's vital interests in the neighborhood. So from the US side, there are also other suspicions which are fed most of the time by Turkey's new orientation, new assertive orientation, which at one point we used to call Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy. In the last 10 years, it has become more and more obvious. Turkey wants to act on an independent platform, wants to develop its own set of relations, and some of those relations with some of the regional actors, some of the non-state regional actors are breeding US suspicions about Turkey's orientation. So those suspicions, whether they are true or not, perceptions, this is an issue of contention without going into it. But at the end, what we see that it is breeding the trust deficit. The third core problem is about the constituencies of US-Turkey relationship on both sides. Unfortunately, it has been eroding on both sides. Many of you are part of that community to some extent. And we have seen that the institutional and elite ownership of the relationship on both sides has been and have been in a decline, and this is also creating a major problem. Of course, there are different reasons why this is the case, especially considering that at its origins, Turkey-US strategic engagement was a product of the particular conditions of the Cold War era, the security establishments at the center of the relationship, the changing domestic priorities and power balances inside Turkey, change of Turkish elites, the trends in US domestic politics. These are all feeding into this problem of institutional ownership, as we identify in the report. The last part is about the declining public support. I think I don't need to tell much about it. Most of us are following it. And as a matter of fact, the GMF recently launched another report, polarization survey. Part of it was also about the public perceptions about the foreign policy. There was an event about it a couple of weeks back, and then there was also a good indication of where the public support on US-Turkey relationship stands inside Turkey, but also in US context, we see that the perception of Turkey is not necessarily in its best shape. So based on it, there is a debate, unfolding debate, as we said, and some of you are actually contributors to debate, as I see the list of participants, and there are different positions in this debate. So some say that the best way from here, the way forward is a reset of sorts based on a grand bargain over issues. And Özgür and I thought a lot about maybe this may be the way to go as well, but at the end of the day, our conclusion was no, not really, because the disagreements over issues are symptoms, not the real cause of the current problems. And in that respect, we need to go back to the foundations. So look at the issue of the strategic framework, not necessarily just trying to iron out divergence over issues and cutting a grand bargain. So that will be good, practical, but it wouldn't solve the real problem. As you may also have noticed, there are also others who are arguing that it is time to decouple, but we see it will be very problematic. And then the indications from both sides are such that it is also not what the parties want. So some others may also say, let it drift as it is, drift apart the parties, more of the same current situation. Some are also arguing that this will be the base, let it as it is. but we argue that no, it is good to think about how to preserve the relationship, how to make it more sustainable, look into ways into the relationship's strategic foundation. So therefore, we claim that the best way will be to operationalize a new sort of modus operandi so that the relationship can be built on stronger foundations that reflect the current reality of the relationship. And we, in the report, have a section where we discuss why we need a framework. We try to justify it based on different discussions of the existing arguments. We engage with some of the arguments. We offer our own counter arguments. Basically, we say that neither the old strategic partnership model, which was created, evolved during the Cold War, is viable, nor letting the relationship evolve based on the current purely transactional platform is desirable. So in that sense, what we need to find is to reset the relationship on a platform that would fall somewhere in between the old strategic partnership model and also some elements of transactionalism. Actually, we are against pure transactionalism, but as you will see, what we propose is what we call structured transactionalism. So in that sense, in the report, we discuss the reasons why the old strategic partnership model is no longer able to govern the relationship. We refer to the factors that feed the current strategic divergence. We think that the systemic transformations, power shifts, as well as the domestic orientations, especially of Turkey, the US global leadership role, the evolution of the US grand strategic debates, these are all creating new realities, a new normal in which the strategic divergence is the case. So the old framework, unfortunately, will not be able to govern the entire range of Turkey-US strategic engagement. Therefore, we think we need to look at transactionalism in its pure form, unregulated, untamed form. We think transactionalism suffers from certain shortcomings, pitfalls. As a matter of fact, there has been a good amount of publications on that issue, reports by other institutions as well, the dangers of transactionalism. But interestingly, what we also argue in the book, the report, transactionalism, the concept has been overburdened during the Trump era because it was also directly related to the individual personalistic version of foreign policy making by President Trump. As a matter of fact, eventually transactionalism, the word transactionalism, the transactionalist approach gained a negative image. So it comes with a baggage. So we argue that despite all the difficulties, some elements of transactionalism should still be preserved. So some elements of transactionalism could still make a useful contribution to a framework that can help govern the relations. So in that sense, we make a case for transactionalism, but in a structured form, in a more institutionalized form, not completely ad hoc, short-termistic, based on individual self-interested power calculus, but on certain institutional platform, certain institutional background. We argue that today what we need is to develop a new governance framework. We need to look at the issues in a new light, in a new perspective, which we will offer in a second. But also we need to reclaim the elements of transactionalism, certain elements of transactionalism, because it is necessary. And we make a big effort in the paper to defend that argument. Our case for transactionalism, elements of structured transactionalism, is based on a couple of arguments. especially first we refer to the erosion of the normative foundations of the strategic relationship. We say that it is not unique to Turkey-US relationship. Also, when we look at US engagement with other allies, NATO allies, as well as other allies in Asia, we see that it is not operating within Cold War era normative foundations. So why the fuss about the US-Turkey relationship all the time? So similar challenges which we talk about Turkey-US relationship, which we also refer to in this report, can also be observed in other US strategic engagements with other allies inside NATO or outside NATO. So in this sense, the need to redefine the alliances is a bigger question that goes well beyond the bilateral US-Turkey context. So that's the bigger, larger trend. So some elements of transactionalism needs to be in terms of US relationship with allies such as Turkey. Secondly, we say that the structured transactionalism fits to the current international security environment, strategic environment, which is in transition. So here, without going too much into detail, let's remember the evolution of European security in the post-Cold War era, the need for flexible arrangements of security cooperation, coalitions of the willing. So some form of flexibility has already been inserted in the management of European security, transatlantic security. And also the recent trends, the discussions about return of great power politics, so on and so forth, return of geopolitics, geography. These are all also feeding to this argument we try to make here. Thirdly, we say that structured transactionalism may provide a flexible way to address some of the alliance challenges. And lastly, we think that as a new administration is there, as there is a debate about a new beginning, so the conjuncture, the time might also be right to rethink, reinsert some elements of structuralism into the bilateral relationship. But the question is the transactional approach we mentioned here compatible with a treaty-based alliance? This is the big counter argument, and we say that there might be ways to integrate the two. As a result, we argue that what we need is a dual approach. This is the way to insert elements of structured transactionalism into US-Turkish partnership to supplement the existing treaty-based security relationship between Turkey and the United States. So as a result, we offer what we call the dual approach, a layered approach, as I will also elaborate in a second, where we say that there is a core of the relationship, US-Turkey strategic relationship. And in addition to the core, there is also an area where there are the secondary issues. So the core of the relationship, in our understanding, is composed of first, Article 5, collective defense commitment, territorial defense commitment, plus the issues that fall within the competence of the transatlantic alliance. So these together form the core of the relationship, and the core should be managed, the alliance relationship within the core should be managed by the existing transatlantic framework. But the second area, issues where we see secondary issues, or if you use the concept from the NATO language, the so-called out of area issues, they should be considered as the secondary issues, and there we should look into ways to introduce what we call the structured transactionalism. And we believe that if such a framework can be operationalized, it can help avoid collisions, mutually hurting collisions between the two countries, which we have seen in recent years. It can also help minimize costs in terms of coordinating policies, managing the issues, but also, especially importantly, it can prevent negative spillovers from the secondary issues to the core of the relationship. As many of you have witnessed in recent years, some of the problems that were encountered in the secondary peripheral issues from time to time did reverberate into the core NATO relationship. Sometimes Syria-related disagreements, PKK, PYD-related disagreements came to affect the discussions, security discussions inside the transatlantic alliance. So we think that if we can develop ways to manage the secondary issues in a separate but complementary framework, it can also help preserve the cohesion between the transatlantic alliance. Overall, we think that this framework would also make a lot of positive impact to the relationship from a US perspective. It can ensure Turkey's cooperation, but at the same time, it can help accommodate Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy. So this is the, I guess, very critical argument we try to make in the paper. So getting Turkey's cooperation is a good objective, but achieving it on Turkey's terms has been the difficult part. This has been laying behind the US-Turkey crisis in the last decades. So the challenge is to find this optimal balance, how to accommodate Turkey's quest for strategic autonomy versus also getting its cooperation. And from a Turkish point of view, as has been emphasized by other reports, many of the participants here are part of this debate as well. Turkey wants to also act more autonomously, in an independent manner, but at the same time, we argue that being strategic autonomous doesn't mean that going it alone. You also need to build alliances. You also need to build coalitions. So the framework we offer here may also be a good addition to Turkey's overall power capabilities, to the extent that it can help base the new coalitions on. But we also underline that getting bound by such a framework, unlike a pure transactional framework, may also act as a certain limitation on Turkey's freedom of maneuver, autonomy, because the pure transactional mode is good, but it also comes with its own risks. So structured transactionalism is, to the extent that it is built on some institutional framework, may also be a factor that can limit some of Turkey's quest for autonomy. So this argument we made in the paper, this is, I guess, a novel approach. Özgür has been talking about it a lot, even before the report on several platforms. How to classify issues? That's the big question. And some of the reports published before have proposed different ways to classify issues. You have seen different categorizations. But we say that we need to have a kind of two-dimensional approach to the issues. On the one hand, there is this common classification which you see in many studies. The issues can be classified based on where the parties stand substantively on a specific topic. So whether they agree or they disagree. So there can be different patterns, a bit agree, more agree, less agree, a bit disagree, more disagree, less disagree. So it's a spectrum between total disagreement and total agreement, convergence. So we keep it, we say that yes, let's divide issues along that spectrum of what we call policy contestation. So as a result, we say that there are issues of convergence or areas of convergence. It is the issues where the parties largely agree on, there is consensus. There are also issues, areas of divergence where the parties deeply disagree and it is hard to bridge their differences. But there are also areas of negotiation where issues are so mixed. The parties have differences, but those differences are not impossible to bridge. So the parties negotiate over them, and over time their objective is to get them to the area of convergence. But we introduce a second dimension here, which is, I guess, the novel part in our report, what we call the governance framework. Irrespective of an issue is contested, converged, or diverged, there is a second dimension. The question of where, under what platform, or on what platform those issues are going to be governed. So this is where we say that the issues can be classified based on whether they are the core issues, which mean they are going to be governed by the treaty-based strategic framework, which is the transatlantic framework. And there are those issues that are the secondary issues, as I just mentioned earlier, and they are the ones to be governed by structured transactionalism. But we also identify a different layer of contention, another dimension of contention, the contention over which governance framework an issue should be placed. So, as we know, the strategic environment has been evolving. NATO's core competences, what falls within NATO, what is out of area, what is not, it is not fixed on stone. Especially in the post-Cold War strategic environment, this has been also an evolving target. So in that respect, we underline that placing issues into the secondary or core category is also subject to disagreement, subject to contestation. Sometimes the parties may want to manage a certain issue inside the core in a transatlantic framework. Sometimes they may want to keep it on the bilateral realm outside NATO's competence, so out of area. So this is also another layer of contention. As a result, we have this 2x2 matrix, which can help us identify issues. An issue could be falling in the core, but in that particular issue, the sides, the parties can diverge, converge, or negotiate. Also, an issue can fall in the secondary category, but then on that particular issue, the parties may diverge, converge, or negotiate. And issues might be contested in terms of where they should be governed, and still the same pattern applies. So based on this, we propose this much fancier diagram to illustrate our argument. So the layered approach, which I just mentioned, inside at the core, the yellowish, orangish part is the core of the relationship. At the core of the core, at the center of the core, there is the Article 5 collective defense clause of NATO. We think that it should be kept separate from the issues. So on that particular foundation of the transatlantic alliance, there should be no policy contestation, policy divergence. If it is, then the entire alliance, the logic of alliance will also fracture. So it is kept outside areas of divergence, negotiation, or convergence classification. But beside the core, there is the second layer of the core. It is the issues in the core that fall within the framework of NATO. And then we argue that those issues, although they are within transatlantic context, still the parties may agree, disagree, or negotiate over those issues. So in between there is this white area. It is the area of contestation. These are the issues in between. The parties are debating whether an issue falls into the core or into the secondary area, and the outer rim, outer circle is the secondary areas. So we believe that such a framework can offer a good way to classify issues, look into issues, and also the framework can also give us an idea about where to look, what to watch, what kind of issues are the most vital, where the risk is, where the bigger risk may be coming from. And then the placement of individual specific issues on this diagram, it is of course not fixed as well. As was mentioned in the introduction by Ian, also Özgür, we conducted a Delphi survey within an expert community, thanks to Emre Erdoğan's assistance. And based on that, based on also our own assessment, we made our own classification. So this is our classification, but again, it's not fixed on the stone. So another expert may have a different opinion, can come up and say, no, issue X is better placed, not there, but here, so on and so forth. And the parties themselves may feel an issue should be classified as such. The experts may have a different opinion, but based on our own assessment of not where the issues should be placed, but where the issues currently do stand, we came up with this distribution. But as I said, it is not fixed, it is not set on stone. It may change, or an issue can evolve over time. For instance, just to give an example, let's take the 2011 Libya contingency, what happened, how it evolved, whether it was inside NATO. Remember the French UK initiative, they started, NATO indirectly supported, but later it was transferred inside NATO, the operation itself. So it shows the dynamic nature of the issues, how they can evolve from one area to another, from one category to another. And then soon I'm gonna share with you our final remarks about our proposals. But as I said, do consider this template as a kind of a new way to look into issues. So the specific placement of individual issues on this diagram is not conclusive, is not definite, is not final. It can change over time depending on the nature of the crisis, but also it may change from one researcher to another. What I think falls here may fall to somewhere else on the diagram based on another expert's evaluation. So our proposals based on this new framework, new way to look into issues, new dual approach that combines structured transactionalism, uses it to supplement the treaty-based core of the relationship. We argue that the parties should think about new ways to restructure the relationship, put it on stronger foundations. We do not offer a template, as was mentioned at the very beginning. We try to come up with some broad ideas. Firstly, we believe that it would be used to introduce some regular strategic reviews into the relationship. And especially this is a big challenge which was identified by some of the decision makers we spoke to, especially the legacy of the Trump era, personalized foreign policy. Now that there is a new administration in office, there is a talk about going back to a more institutional foreign policy. Introducing some more regular strategic reviews between the parties would be good. Also, from a Turkish point of view, the transition to the presidential system, the new power distribution in the capital, Ankara, and the dynamics between the presidential office and the foreign ministry. So maybe a review should also take into account the new realities, the new institutional setup here in Ankara as well. Secondly, we believe that there is a need to revisit institutional ownership of the relationship. As they say in the textbooks, alliances need nurturing. Without relevant strategic communities, constituencies, it won't be viable to sustain alliances in the mid to long run. So in that sense, talking about new ways to reinstitutionalize relationship is needed, together with the first item, strategic reviews, institutional ownership issue. I guess the parties, to the extent that they are serious about getting the relationship back on track, they can help address the trust deficit, which we mentioned earlier at the beginning, also the institutional ownership problem. But here, in that respect, maybe some of the participants in our study emphasize that, for instance, getting the parliamentary congressional dimension into the relationship again more seriously might be one specific proposal. The third proposal we put forward is about the confidence building measures. We believe it will be worthwhile to invest in them, and especially the language of coercion, coercive diplomacy, which has been the case in the relationship in recent years by both sides. I guess this is not good. It doesn't comply with the spirit of alliance. So some specific measures, perhaps rethinking about cooperation in intelligence sharing might be one potential option. We have also put emphasis on the defense procurement, defense industry cooperation as a way to help rebuild confidence. And then we have this fancy formulation, thanks to Özgür: cooperate where possible, fix what is fixable, and manage policy divergence. So what do we mean? We mean that there is no one-size-fits-all approach. All issues need to be approached with a different perspective in mind. So this is what we mean here. In the areas of convergence, we think that the main, of course, these are easier to manage, perhaps easiest to manage. The main approach should be to cooperate, deepen cooperation, and also use them, highlight them to emphasize the returns, dividends of cooperation to both sides, so sort of create a positive story, positive spin in the relationship. In terms of areas of negotiation, we argue that the parties should continue to cooperate as much as possible to bridge differences, but also the eventual objective of the areas of negotiation should be to move them from the negotiation area into the convergence area. In the areas of divergence in the diagram, this is the area that requires the most attention in terms of alliance management. And this is where the parties need to think about how they will manage crisis management capabilities. We think that ad hoc responses to crisis will not be good. Maybe setting up some mechanisms. We have seen some applications in recent years in the context of Syria, in the context of some of the other issues in recent years. Some of you are familiar with how certain task forces were introduced into the relationship. Also, from time to time, the parties used to have good bilateral committees on certain specific issues. But in recent years, because of this personalized foreign policy era, the sidelining of the State Department, so on and so forth, some of these committees, although they have not been functional, maybe revisiting how such mechanisms could be made more institutional so that they can respond to the crises emerging over areas of divergence would be the way to go. But despite the overall general crisis management, we also lastly identify that there are two areas. These require especially special attention. Otherwise, if they are not managed, they can turn into kind of make or break issues, especially the engagement with the third parties, especially in the context of the third parties, the proxy dynamics, non-state actors. This is becoming quite an explosive issue in the bilateral relationship. When we look at the US engagement with the PYD, YPG in the Syria context, from a US point of view, Turkish engagement with Hamas or other regional actors, they have become from time to time explosive issues in the bilateral relationship. So the parties may need to rethink the engagement with the third parties, especially the proxy dynamics, because this has become the reality of the new geopolitics in the Turkish neighborhood, in the MENA region. The proxy dynamics, they need to be watched more carefully. Lastly, what we call the overlapping contentions, they need even extra special attention. What do we mean by the overlapping contentions? It is those areas that are falling into areas of divergence. So the parties, by their very nature, substantively, they disagree on those issues. Plus, moreover, they are also in the white category, in the upper left on the white category, meaning they are the issues in between. The governance mechanism is also debated. So there are two layers of contention. The parties disagree substantively, but they do also disagree in terms of where to govern, how to govern. So these are what we call the issues of double contention. And they are indeed the ones that can turn into very explosive. And as Özgür calls them, they can be toxic issues, such as S-400. So we managed to write a report about Turkey-US relationship without using S-400 until the very, very, very end of the report, in the very last sentences. So we didn't want to get into the specific discussions about specific issues, but we argue that the current evolving crisis in the last couple of years still on the table. It is the toxic one because it falls in that particular category. The parties disagree, but they also disagree how to and where to manage it. So they need special attention. They need to be closely watched and handled accordingly. And without going into detail as regards the question of what we think regarding S-400 issue, our understanding is that solution would require a rethinking about the broader issue of defense procurement within NATO. The best way will be to move it to the core, handle it in the core. But once we are there, once we try to handle this issue, just looking at it from a prism of Turkey not possessing them would not be helpful either. In return for Turkey giving up, perhaps, the entire issue of defense procurement should also be rethought within a transatlantic framework. Inside NATO, we have defense planning as part of the core, but defense procurement are left to the national policies, and it involves all the issues about technology transfers, joint production, so on and so forth. A genuine solution, we believe, can only be solved if it is put into a bigger context. It cannot be just singled out as the specific instance of Turkey acquiring Russian weapons. So there I stop. I guess my time is up. Then after the discussion, we are gonna come back to the Q&A, and Özgür will be happy to step in as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Şaban. quite a hard work that you had put in the report and also in presenting it. Thank you very much. And we all look forward to the final version of the report and the constructive debate that it will spark on the US-Turkey engagement. This is just a reminder that you can submit your questions anytime you want. I only see 7 of them. Welcome to submit them. And before handing it to Jonathan, Özgür, do you have any comments, remarks to add?
I actually don't. Şaban made a very comprehensive presentation, so I'll try to weigh in during the question and answer.
Okay, thank you. And then Jonathan, over to you. Look forward to hearing your comments.
Ceylan, thank you. And Şaban, thank you too, and Özgür as well. And thank you for this report. And I think it's hard to follow that presentation because it was so comprehensive, and it hits the nail on the head for so many of the key issues in the relationship, but also providing a framework. And I think this new framework for managing the relationship is critically important. And I did want to just thank for, I think when you mentioned at the top who the key partners are that you've worked with to do this, you understand the depth of the engagement, both of the US Embassy in Ankara, Turkish MFA, TOBB, but also others that have joined in to try to really impact the relationship. And I just want to congratulate you on that, but it also highlights, I think, the keen interest to try to figure out how to take the relationship from where it's been to a better place. And I think that's important, is that there's still an investment on all sides, both in Washington and in Ankara, to this relationship. So thank you for that. And thank you for this report. And I think it's important because it helps breathe new life and strategic thinking into the framework of the relationship. And I think that what you're trying to do is to provide an expanded toolbox for policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. And this includes others that are watching this as well on the European side, which wasn't really discussed because it's obviously a key component of the relationship. But I think if you look at the narrative of the report, it talks a lot about this golden age, that there was never a golden age in the US-Turkish relations, but there has been areas of deep cooperation and greater synergy. Incirlik didn't come up, but obviously this is a relationship that has had, I call them golden moments. Maybe we didn't have a golden era, but we have golden moments. And when we're looking at this, it's true that the construct of the Cold War doesn't exist, but that ended the Cold War 30 years ago. And so we're way beyond the point. And I really try to think about Turkey more in this relationship, US-Turkish relationship, from 9/11, for the perspective of 9/11 for this conversation. And I think it's very telling right now, we have a new administration in Washington that they're right now they're still getting their sea legs, meaning that still filling in key positions of those that are going to be responsible for this relationship. But there's a lot of people with tremendous experience. If we shouldn't forget that President Biden, I think he traveled to Turkey 4 times during the Obama administration. And I think it's quite significant. He knows Turkey, those that are in leadership positions, from Secretary Blinken to National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and others on down, know Turkey quite well. And I think this bodes well. Doesn't mean that the relationship is going to work perfectly, but you have those that are very schooled and understand the importance of this relationship. And just recently, Ambassador Satterfield had an interview where he labeled Turkey as a valued ally of the United States. So I think the message is there about the relationship. And that's why particularly this report was so important. I wanted to add to this too, because I think both in terms of how you lay out convergence, transactionalism, divergence. I mean, this sounds like a classic way that you should be conducting diplomacy and relations with countries, because all these specific areas are part of a relationship. And I do agree with Şaban, like, it's a very different day today than it was a month and a half ago when you had President Trump. You're no longer going to see sort of transactionalism be sort of the buzzword. And when President Biden spoke a few weeks ago at the State Department in the United States, he basically turned to Secretary Blinken and said, when you speak, you're speaking for me. and I'm not going to, in essence, I'm not going to undermine you. So the State Department, Department of Defense, key components of the U.S. national security strategy are ready for this type of exercise of strengthening the strategic reviews. But Turkish leaders should have full confidence that when they are speaking for the United States and U.S. policy. And so institutional ownership of the relationship there's a real new opportunity, especially on the U.S. side. I think the bigger question for the U.S. is whether there is institutional ownership to be had on the Turkish side, and whether the power vertical in Turkey, which starts with Erdogan, is open and available to having the type of conversations, the type of structured managed relationship that I think has already been discussed, and is the language of managed relationship has already been used by the United States in an early conversation between the new administration and Ankara. So I agree that there's an opportunity to build confidence. I think there's opportunity for some golden moments. And I think part of this will depend on the power vertical in Turkey and whether or not there's opportunity to engage, and whether Turkish officials outside of President Erdogan and a small group is able to engage. So I do think that when you're looking at the US right now, and I'll just talk a little bit, and then I know we have questions and very little time, so I want to make sure we get to questions. But I do think that there's going to be some issues that are going to be areas of divergence that certainly have to make it onto your chart, Oscar. I hope that these areas that where we talk about distribution of current issues widens beyond the national security lens. I know those are the constructive, those are the issues, a lot of contention, but to fill that in with issues like refugee policy, where the United States has a new policy on refugees that President Biden announced, addressing issues like the Muslim ban, which is really important that this new administration is looking at. Turkey has taken on millions of Syrian refugees, and which is incredibly commendable in what took place, but that should be part of the conversation. COVID cooperation wasn't raised, but that is something that acutely impacts both Americans and Turks. And I recall an effort early by President Erdogan to send PPE to the United States. Why aren't we talking about areas of cooperation there? Democracy and human rights. President Erdogan, there's an ongoing judicial reform strategy. I think there's a great deal of skepticism whether that's actually going to happen or for whom that happens to. That's an area of cooperation. Tech and tech ecosystem, 5G, artificial intelligence. So there's a number of areas. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think they're particularly important. But I do want to say, here's what I think is going to matter to the new administration, but also how the new administration is going to react to Turkey, because I think this is important. Democracy and human rights. There isn't a speech that the president has made in the United States that hasn't focused on democracy and human rights. I know this ends up maybe in your divergence area, but it shouldn't. I don't think the US looks at Turkey as a monolithic country that is Erdogan alone. And I think there are also others, and I'm sure in Turkey too, are not only looking at what's happening today, but what Turkey might look like 10 years from now. And so the people-to-people relationship beyond the elites is critical. And I think you're going to see a US that wants to engage beyond the elite and wants to engage, and that should be should be addressed. US's experience, I think, its own brush with what it thinks is authoritarianism in President Trump that culminated in the events of January 6th. And I think that particular issue of the brush where US democracy was threatened and COVID-19 is really is a driver for the Biden administration. So finding ways to work together in these issues, whether it's civil society to civil society, think tank to think tank, business to business, people to people, is critical. And one thing we learned with COVID-19 is this has all been shut down. As Oscar said, we would rather be having these conversations in person where people are actually able to sit across the table, break bread, raku, we could have some drinks together, but that doesn't happen today. So we have these global issues that I think can be added, pandemic recovery, climate change, UN. China isn't on the, maybe I missed, but I think China is something that clearly the US is focused on and needs to be included. And, you know, as Biden mentioned last week at the Munich Security Conference, the transatlantic relationship is the cornerstone. So I appreciate Article 5. President Biden spoke specifically to Article 5, and I think it's directed at Turkey and all allies, that he would uphold that commitment to Article 5 and views the transatlantic relationship as the cornerstone to address issues in the 20th and 21st century. And when we think about this, this is not to the exclusion of Turkey, it's to the inclusion of Turkey, and finding ways to carry that out is important. Lastly, I'm just going to end with this. Things you might see, things you might not see. You're not going to see any more midnight diplomacy and phone calls like we saw previously. We know that transactionalism, but you're also not going to see the US president tweet that he's going to destroy the Turkish economy. I think there is a recognition from the US side how much the Turkish public has suffered. The Turkish economy has been going through a difficult moment, and how COVID-19 has impacted it, because we are experiencing something similar right now. And I think, you know, policy isn't directed, and I don't think you'll see policy directed at the Turkish people. It's much more nuanced. I think a lot of the challenges tend to be at the top level, at the more elite level. So I would suggest people go back and reread about NATO allies, look back at some of the speeches that Biden talks again about whole, free, and at peace. I think this includes Turkey as well in this. And as I mentioned, challenges that outlined, that you and Şaban have outlined on divergence. I did want to just say one quick thing about the S-400s. I don't see any budge from in this administration, this particular issue. I think if there's an expectation that there's a way out of this, an easy way out, there's not. And I think it goes back to these core issues, these cornerstone issues that Biden has put in his framework and the new administration in terms of the key issues that they care about. NATO allies, that share the same direction, understand the same challenges, including particularly Russia. There is no way, we didn't mention Congress, but the U.S. policy system is multi-layered with Congress also there as well, that feels very strongly not only about CAATSA sanctions, about Russia, but also making certain that there's no weakness in the U.S. signaling on these issues. While I do think that a deeper role between the Turkish Grand National Assembly and Congress would be welcome, because I think that's one of the areas where the relationship has been weakened. I don't think you'll see any budging on the U.S. side on these issues. So again, I'm going to end there because I think we have limited time, to answer 17 questions now. I just will end with this. In a little over a decade, that Turkey has managed to kind of, and I think particularly not Turkey, but President Erdogan has managed, I think, an enormous feat in Washington. He's managed to lose support from friends of Turkey, national security, White House, parts of Congress, those groups that have been supportive of Turkey, U.S. business interests, and it to me, for somebody who's worked on this relationship from the congressional side and then executive branch, there's all the opportunity in the world to reverse the backslide and to find a new strategic framework. So, congratulations on pulling this together. One thing I would ask for you is that we do more on the follow-up of the strategic framework, that we work to see that it is implemented and how it can be implemented. And I think that would be helpful because the external efforts by organizations like GMF or TOBB are really needed right now, given the breakdown in the relationship. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. Very useful, somewhat worrisome and promising at the same time. We only have 20 minutes left for the Q&A session, so let's dive into it. And it looks like we have a winner for the session. That's Russia. The questions from Nicholas McLean, Maggie Gray, Tuta Baleta, and Botan Buran more or less ask the same thing. Where does the Turkey and Russia approachment stand, and in what relation this affects the Turkey's relations with the United States and its NATO membership? And I think it's both for you and for Şaban Bey and Jonathan for you. So let's first start with Şaban Bey. Would you go first, Şaban Bey?
Yeah, why not? Yeah, it is in the, of course, definitely divergence category, and then also somehow in between. Turkey wants to keep it outside of the transatlantic framework at the bilateral, but from time to time it is dealt with within transatlantic framework. Let's recall for instance, the Baltics initiative recently and other developments, what has been happening. But of course, it also depends on what engagement of NATO are we talking about, the broader Turkey-NATO relationship, or NATO's role in the Black Sea, in the Caucasus, NATO's role in Syria, NATO's role in Libya. These are all come with different background, different contexts, and depending on where it is located, I guess the issue is dealt with differently. And then overall, I mean, the big Russia questions about the Russian neo-revisionism in the last few years, more than a decade now, how to respond to the increasingly assertive Russia of recent years. So on that question, Turkey has definitely taken a different approach from the United States, starting with the 2008 Russia-Georgia war, and all the way here. We have also seen it in the case of the Crimea conflict, annexation, so on and so forth. Turkey is concerned, but takes a different approach. That's why it is an issue of divergence. In my understanding, also, it ties to the S-400 issue. It is in the same category. It is one of the areas to watch because it puts the biggest pressure on the alliance relationship. It is one of the make or break kind of issues because it is an area of divergence, plus it is contested in terms of how to manage, how to differentiate. But this also reflects how Turkey's own interests of pursuing a new approach with the regional interlocutors created interest divergence with the United States. I mean, when you just look at specific areas, the book Eastern Europe, you may see that Russia is a challenge in the Black Sea, it is a challenge in Syria, it is a challenge. But even in the Syrian theater, when you look at northeast Syria, Russia plays a different role. In certain issues, I remember President Erdogan, even during the time of President Obama, he underlined many times that when it comes to certain of Turkey's security concerns, President Putin was more sensitive to Turkey's concerns than President Obama. So in that respect, the Russia-Turkey relationship is not a black and white thing. It is not a straight threat that comes from Russia, and despite that threat, Turkey is insensitive to American policy. No, Turkey has also different shades of gray when it comes to its relationship with Russia, and as a result, Turkey has been breeding this relationship in the last 2 decades or so. It is an increasingly strategic relationship. It is gaining a strategic dimension despite all the rivalry, so on and so forth. From a US perspective, of course, it is hard to accommodate to this new reality, and this is creating a challenge, and I think it will continue to create challenges. There won't be a straight solution. Jonathan or Özgür?
Thank you, Şaban. Ceylan, may I weigh?
Of course, of course.
Thank you. I think we should put the Turkey-Russia relationship into context. I think just calling it a rapprochement may be misleading. Actually, the Turkish-Russian relationship can be best characterized as Mustafa Aydın has recently done in some of his writings, as competitive cooperation. So on the one hand, they are cooperating on a limited number of issues, but on the other hand, they're also competing on other issues. As we are talking of Turkish-Russian rapprochement, Turkey and Russia are actually conducting proxy wars in Syria and Libya and are on the two opposite ends of the Cold War. Fortunately, the frozen conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. So I don't think that this is a relationship that can be just characterized as cooperation. Also, we should look into what has brought Turkey and Russia closer in the recent years on those limited number of issues. It's actually the mutual feeling both in Turkey and Russia that they are excluded by the West. So on issues that they felt they were excluded by the West, they decided to cooperate. Now, most of these issues actually fall into the area that in the report we call secondary issues that are outside of the jurisdiction of NATO. Now, as Şaban has said a number of times, let me reinforce this. I think that defense procurement and S-400 systems could change the nature of Turkey-Russian relationship, because the S-400 procurement is pushing the Turkey-Russia relationship from tactical towards strategic. And also, let's also look a little bit about look a little bit into the core NATO issues or the nucleus of NATO. Now, the nucleus of NATO is Article 5, and defense procurement is not part of the Washington Treaty. But actually, defense procurement is a natural extension of Article 5, and ultimately, it should be dealt with as part of NATO's jurisdiction. But of course, it goes both ways. On the one hand, Turkey should not consider making defense procurements from NATO's adversaries. But on the other hand, Turkey should be able to fulfill its needs, its defense procurement needs within NATO. So neither has happened in the past. So ultimately, in a better future, I believe that defense procurement should be dealt with as part of the NATO sphere, and including Turkey, NATO allies should not feel the need to and should not buy weapon systems from NATO's adversaries.
Thank you, Özgür. Jonathan?
I think Özgür's last point was exactly the perspective from Washington about not buying this type of weapon system. And I think, there's divergent views in Washington on why that system was bought and what that means, or the direct relationship between Putin and Erdogan. I think from, obviously this new administration has come up very clearly to say that they view Russia as a major challenge. And I think that's been quite clear that there's a very different relationship now from the White House directly on this specific issue than there was with Trump. I mean, very similar, in a similar way that Trump's relationship was with Erdogan, so was it with Putin as well. And that's changed dramatically. So I think I expect this to be an issue. And one of the major goals for Putin has been to split the transatlantic alliance. And I think there's nothing that pleases Moscow more than to see Turkey buying its weapons and also cooperating. But that cooperation, these deals come with longer term impact on Turkey. And Turkey, as much as you think that Turkey is an independent player, when it becomes dependent on Moscow, when it deals with them in spaces like the South Caucasus in Azerbaijan, when it places new troops on the ground, we know that they don't leave, the Russians. And I think it's Turkey is much better placed, even if it wants to run an independent foreign policy on some issues, to cooperate with Washington, with its Western partners, because over the long run, having Russia in these spaces and not leaving creates instability, and that instability is a tool of the Kremlin. And so I think what you're seeing today is concern about these deals, these relationships, or people concerned that I think somebody used the word condominium. I don't know if it was condominium policy of, sort of that Turkey and Russia will divide these spaces, and it doesn't work like that. It won't. And I don't necessarily think that it makes Turkey more secure when it deals in these relationships with Russia in a way that not only threatens its security, but also its relationships with the West. So there's a cost to this. And I did want to say that I don't think we're in any more too just with the new administration, which you didn't have with the previous there is global competition. Saban, you're talking about this. And I think very much that this new administration is focused on issues of authoritarianism, corruption. I think that this administration is going full blown in that direction. And when you look at the opposite side of these issues, you see leaders like Putin and you see that challenge. So I think this is about to be ramped up much more deeply, this strategy. And I do think it will be a major source of contention in a number of different spaces. With that said, I did want to say that Turkey could play and can play a very important role in a number of these regions. As you mentioned, like Black Sea, we're likely to see more tension on issues like Belarus or Ukraine. Ukrainian sovereignty is important. You may see as well importance of that engagement together in places like the Western Balkans. And I do think that there's opportunity with NATO. I just don't want to downplay this Russia issue, which is not just a foreign policy issue for the United States. It's become a domestic issue, and it's been entangled in a number of issues, including interference in U.S. elections, cyber wins. There's a number of things that are going to just keep fueling this relationship, and the perspective of Washington seeing the S-400s and seeing Turkey's move in that direction, it can only serve in your sort of scope of work to hold the relationship in a very difficult space.
Thank you, Jonathan. The second prize of the Q&A session went to S-400s, but the issue was already blended in our speakers' input and also in the responses to this question, the previous question about Russia. So I will just continue with the questions on divergence between the AKP government and also NATO and United States. And these came from Joseph Bosco and Paul Levin. So what do you think, whether this can be fixed, the ideological divergence between the AKP government and the West? Let's do the same line. Şaban Bey, would you go first?
Yeah, in the report, we do emphasize the weakening of the normative foundations of the traditional US-Turkey relationship. We refer to the changing elites, so that's a reality. We cannot ignore it, but we still argue that in terms of security partnership, still there is ground. So the pragmatism, the structured transactionalism, this is where it comes into play. Even in the polls, maybe some of you did follow the event organized by GMF before, based on the polarization survey. When it comes to questions about who is the country that threatens Turkey the most, so on and so forth, you see quite anti-American attitude. But when it comes to questions about security provision of Turkey, where Turkey's real security interests lie, still there is support into transatlantic security frameworks. So we see a similar pragmatic attitude on the part of the Turkish elite, AK Party elite as well. So in that sense, this is what we mean. Keep it functional, but beyond the ideological dimension, there are the national interests involved here, the other institutions. I think still the transatlantic security engagement remains a priority for Turkey's security establishment. This is the way we look at it. Özgür, would you like to add anything more?
I would actually, Şaban. I mean, I would like to add two perspectives. First of all, if there were no divergences between the United States and Turkey, and if the cultural divergence was not increasing, this exercise would be unnecessary. I mean, this exercise is being conducted under the realization that there is policy divergence between the United States and Turkey, and there is culture. I mean, in terms of strategic culture, but also in terms of domestic political culture, there is a divergence as well. So this exercise is about how to govern the relationship when these divergences are already happening. But we are not assuming that these divergences will be perpetual. I mean, there may be a decade when actually the divergence ends and there's more convergence on all of those issues, which would mean that the issues that fall into the area of divergence would be actually fewer. So from another perspective, is it how manageable is it? Like, there are also other questions. Somebody asked a question about, let's say, journalists being imprisoned in Turkey. Of course, I mean, there are the Turkish democracy has been backtracking for a long time, and the result cannot be good. The result will be negative. I mean, public opinion on Turkey will be even more negative in the United States and the European Union. So this is inevitable. But then what should we do? I mean, should we say, okay, Turkish democracy is backsliding and public opinion on Turkey is negative in Europe and the United States? There is nothing to do, but we need to decouple. So that's actually what we are trying to avoid. We're trying to offer a framework which would, even if not eliminate, which would put the problems in compartments so that they can be resolved under more favorable conditions.
Thank you, Özgür. Jonathan? Şaban Bey.
Just an addition, I mean, the specific survey or other surveys, like Kadir Has polls, they all indicate that skepticism towards the United States, quote unquote, anti-Americanism is across the board, not only the AK Party base, but also other party supporters. And in some indicators, even CHP supporters are more critical of the United States and the AK Party base in certain questions. So that should be put in that context as well, I would say.
Thank you. Jonathan?
I just wanted to add that, I think, those numbers, I remember sort of famously looking at Turkish polls about the United States and sort of always being below a certain threshold. But I worry too that just in the context of what's being, I think that there's a couple of differences between how the U.S. in the United States policy on Turkey is, is largely a sort of a government and sort of Washington based, not really sort of a focus of sort of writ large nationally. But I do worry about disinformation in Turkey and about control of media and messaging. I know that there was the unfortunate incident of, and really I condolences to those families who lost loved ones just a few days ago in northern Iraq. But this issue of trust between the two sides, which certainly played out in sort of the response, between the United States and Turkey, but also the quick way in which President Erdogan quickly went out and kind of used this particular issue, to bash the United States. And I think the sort of U.S. response, and I think we've seen that over a period of time, and I think it's one of the more unhealthy ecosystems is disinformation. And it's not to say that there isn't policy divergences or concerns from the Turkish public, because I'm sure that's the case. But they have a hard time in certain media to articulate the concerns Turkish citizens have about their own government. And so, I just wanted to add that I think making certain that top level leadership, if you want to have a constructive relationship that you can manage, not having leaders go out, and I think the US had this very real challenge of Trump going out and undermining those that were part of maintaining the relationship. I think if we're talking about wanting to put in place a new strategic framework, it means that you can't have what it would be unhelpful to have President Erdogan sort of consistently going after and bashing key leaders from other countries. Now, he may not do that because it's to his domestic political advantage to do that, but I would just say whether we're talking about the United States or Germany or leaders in Europe, I think that is incredibly important to helping at a top level allow us to be able to manage the relationship is not having this top level disinformation. And I do think these issues of media freedom and disinformation do matter for this relationship because it colors how people view the United States. And this has not been just 1 year ago. This has been over, a decade of disinformation internally that has really colored the relationship. And I think it's important to add that, and we need to reverse that trend.
Thank you, Jonathan. You just mentioned the trust issue, and I just want to conclude with the first question we received, and I would kindly ask you to maybe respond with only a couple of sentences and how the trust issue between Turkey and the United States can be mended. Şaban Bey, 2 sentences.
Yeah, I mean, as we tried to argue, more dialogue, serious dialogue, and build the institutional foundations or rethink the institutional foundations. And then some specific measures. I guess we know the issues, so there is no ignorance on either side. So at this point, we don't need to educate Turkey or the United States about each other's. But what we need is to come up with decisive action to address the issues divergence, and it requires more serious institutional relationship.
Thank you. Özgür?
Ceylan, I'm sorry that there are actually several questions that were leaving unaddressed. But I would actually like to take this chance to respond to at least one of them, which is also related to the trust issue. Somebody asked, I cannot see it right now, but if Turkey is actually ready to institutionalize the relationship as the new US administration is about to institutionalize US foreign policy, I think that's a very good question. And I do not know the answer as of today. But actually, speaking retrospectively, 2 things happened during the last couple of years. The first thing, in the United States, there was a president who preferred personalizing relations. What happened in Turkey is, as Turkey transformed from a parliamentary system to a presidential system, the institutional framework is still in transition. But what we have seen in Turkey is that there's a palace-centric governance emerging in Turkey, which actually weakens other institutions that are not part of the palace structure, which does not bode well for reinstitutionalizing the US-Turkey relationship, which is very important. Let me take this chance to say, this opportunity to say that the Turkish Foreign Ministry should play a bigger role in US-Turkey relations than has been the case during the last couple of years, because if a relationship is institutionalized, it's more predictable, it's more stable. There are multiple lines of communications that could prevent misunderstandings. There can be actually immediate conversations before leaders or ministers make statements. And Jonathan actually has explained very well why the statement of the US State Department about the PKK execution of Turkish citizens was a reflection of mistrust. Yes, it is quite telling that the United States needed to verify something that the Turkish government has said. But if the relationship was actually more institutionalized, perhaps the verification process could have been concluded much faster at lower levels, and the US State Department could have verified the situation before making this statement, and this would certainly contribute to mutual trust. And our apologies to everyone who asked questions that we could not address.
May I just chime in, because there is one question that is just related to the core of the project, and this is from Yusuf Işık. Maybe Şaban Bey, just for a minute, would you be kind enough to answer it? Is there a NATO ally which has a transactional relationship with the United States, be it structural? Please unmute yourself.
I think, I mean, there were also some other questions about the model abstract. So you can apply it to other allies, take France and also UK. I mean, you can look at their engagement outside of NATO framework in other issues, other areas. So in that sense, I guess definitely the overall perspective which we are trying to offer here isn't unique to Turkey. Similar patterns, dynamics can also be observed in the case of other relationships.
Şaban, let me also weigh in here because we discussed this issue with you recently. We just looked into it and saw that actually the more issues that lie outside of the NATO jurisdiction a NATO ally has, the more likely it is to have transactional relations on those issues with other NATO allies. Now, what makes Turkey unique is mainly because of its geography. Turkey is increasingly having actually policy issues that fall outside of the jurisdiction of NATO. And in this case, in this issue, Turkey is actually unique within NATO. But as Şaban has said, we have developed this model of relationship, this framework of relationship for US-Turkey relations, but we also left it somewhat abstract so that it can be applied in other settings as well.
Thank you. Jonathan, any concluding remarks? Very short ones.
Yeah, no, I would say just, I think the model and the framework that was set out is really, I think it's the right type of framework. And I appreciate the flexibility that you have put into it too on issues that are in or outside of NATO. And I think, one thing, at least with this new administration, is that unlike the previous administration, it's interested in both the core NATO issues, but also maybe in a very different way looking at Libya, Syria, Iran, Iraq, and the South Caucasus in a way that perhaps the previous administration did not. So I would, push for this type of framework, following up on this too. And the only thing I would say is it's just important to make the concerted effort on both sides to invest in a short and medium and longer term strategy to build a relationship. There's, the breakdown of these lines of communication, to me, many of which were built up over, over several decades, collapsed quite quickly. And, it's much easier to destroy them and sort of have them atrophy than to build them up. And it's just a reminder how important diplomacy is. And I do think that this new administration is really ready in everything they say to really empower, whether it's Department of Defense, whether it's State Department and other parts of the US government to engage. So I hope the Turkish side is ready and, and has the structures in place to find also some golden moments that we can both turn to and start to build a better narrative.
Thank you. And likewise, I also want to apologize that timing didn't allow us to address all the questions, but we will be at your disposal once the report is published, and feel free to send your questions via email. And I want to conclude by thanking Ian, Şaban Bey, Özgür, Jonathan for the invaluable comments. And I also want to thank my colleague William for his operational support. And of course, to you all, to our audience, for joining us today. And for any reason, if you missed a part of this session, this will be published on the GMF's website and also put on the YouTube channel, GMF's YouTube channel. And with that, I conclude. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ceylan.
Thank you.